So this video follows a very simple concept, as I set myself a little challenge and took this chord progression, from which I tried to draw some short but clean compositional sketches surrounding the style of our beloved Johnny Brahms. I selected 6 of my favorite attempts that I'm gonna play, and after each one I give a condensed short review about the applied compositional procedures, especially concerning textures and how those may relate to the style of Brahms. As always, all scores you're gonna see are available on my Patreon site. Maybe you should listen to the plain chords first, as this will be the harmonic foundation of each example. To me, this is a progression of falling thirds leading into a 2-5-1 cadence. You'll see that I will occasionally replace the dominant 7th chord by common functional equivalents, such as the diminished 7th chord or the dominant 7th decorated with an additional 9th. In some examples, I will use the dominant as half cadence to be able to repeat the entire phrase, which will lead to all sorts of periodical forms. Not in the following though. Let's begin with a basic example. To me, this is like Brahms in a nutshell, as it kinda assembles several of the cliché features, such as the 2-against-3 polyrhythm and of course the thirds and sixths, drawing a sequential melody above widely spaced out left-hand arpeggios. A characteristic feature is as well diminished 7th chords descending into the abyss, in this case even with the beam drawn over the bar line, which is a reoccurring visual aspect of Brahms scores. So let's check out the next example. In this one, I broke the chords into triplets, going in contrary motion, and grabbed those thirds on top with the pinky. Just at the phrase endings, I broke up with that texture and especially marked those events with a rhythmic constellation that Brahms by no means executed to expert level. I'm of course referring to those hemiolas. In this case, it means to divide the established pulse of 2 triplets into 3 units, which creates the feeling of pushing the brake, and thus can be used as a sort of composed retardando. This effect is as well supported by that 2-against-3 rhythm that I applied onto the cadential dominant. Another little detail I want to highlight is that I used the lowest key of the piano, which is a thing I can't remember to have seen elsewhere than in Brahms music. In the context of D minor, this is the dominant's root, and thus definitely gives a brutal effect. Alright, next one. In this one, I as well used the chord progression twice and thus created an irregular 13-bar period with a stretched out dominant closing the antecedent and once more a hemiola before the final cadence, this time stretched over 2 bars with a characteristic beaming. A Brahmsian horizontal perspective is taken by that abstract descending line that I just pull over the chords, which creates a succession of 4-3 suspensions, so there is a somewhat contrapuntal aspect going on. When I'm picking up that initial phrase in the second part again, I'm not just changing the left-hand accompaniment, but as well add a middle voice that's echoing the upper voice in a somewhat imitative manner. The thing is, Brahms was kinda allergic against redundancies, so a repetition of a phrase is in many cases legitimized by coming up with a variation of the original idea, a concept that later on has been theorized by Arnold Schönberg among the term entwickelnde Variation that he deducted directly from the music of Brahms.
Interesting. Indeed.
Next. I know this one is a little over the top, so let's just call it Brahms inspired. This is as well a period with unequal parts, and as well in this one I went for a varied repetition of the initial phrase by adding the octaves in the left to create more dynamic intensity. I allowed myself to prolong the chord progression with the sixth chord to each of the first three triads. The overall harmonic complexity is increased via the use of the lower chromatic appoggiaturas and the suspensions that occur throughout the figuration and distort the actual local harmony to a degree that those virtually can be seen as autonomous chords themselves, although the perceived sound panorama of the original progression is still well recognizable. The ending looks a little bit like one of those hyper-jacked MuseScore sheets you can see a lot on YouTube these days. There is actually several examples of Brahms' original scores whose visual aspect comes pretty close to what a 16-year-old MuseScore nerd tinkers together on a Sunday afternoon. So let's go back to what I tinkered last Sunday. If you look closer, you will recognize that this is just a 2-5-1 cadence. The beaming in this case relates to the maintained figurative pattern that this time uses the upper neighbors to the chord tones. On the final arpeggio, I tried to draw a reference to the very beginning, but rather more on a submotivic layer, by picking up the G sharp again that's aiming at the chord's fifth that I used as well on the upbeat chord. Next. I guess this score is self-explanatory. I went for the Brahmsian concept of strict syncopation, so the melody is staggered to the right by an eighth, whilst the left hand accompanies by that dotty arpeggios, and I resigned to repeat the chord progression. Now this is again a 10-bar phrase, and you're probably beginning to ask, would Brahms do this kind of phrasings as well? Although it is a common textbook truism that Brahms was a conservative or somewhat academic composer, I wouldn't put too much stock into this notion, especially when it comes to form. Well, of course, you'll find mostly 4 and 8 bar phrases in his music, but there's countless exceptions where Brahms goes for irregular phrases and uneven bar groupings. This most iconic A minor intermezzo begins with a 4 plus 5 bar period. Number 7 of the same cycle shows a 10 bar sentence of a 4 plus 6 bar grouping. This ballad's initial theme is a very clear period of 2 5 bar units, and the A section of the final piece of Opus 76 is 15 bars of I don't know what it actually is. So we all should just chill a little bit on this topic. Next. In this one, I was going for an obvious ripoff, as I took the Brahms original texture of a piece that I'm gonna reveal in a minute. The main melodic idea is to maintain a horizontal guideline throughout the entire section that starts on top and on the second part switches into the middle voice. Harmonically, this one is really composed against the grain, as the harmonic rhythm and the meter don't seem to match at all. The structural idea is actually that of a shifted hemiola, which distorts the metrical perception in the listener fundamentally. It's impossible to recognize the ascribed 3/4 meter apart from the phrase endings. This expanded concept of the hemiola seems to be one of the crucial aspects of Brahms' music, and I want to show you two original examples that capitalize on this very concept in two different ways. You'll see that this section resembles in many parts pretty much the chord progression I used for this video, and just as in my attempt the harmonic rhythm never really matches the ascribed meter, listen and try to feel the triple time you see on the sheet. As in some of my videos, it can get a little nerdy towards the end, so who stayed up to this point deserves a real geeky original example. In this one, a 6/8 meter carries a hemiolic melody in the middle voice in straight quarters, but that's shifted by an eighth note to the right. The melody is surrounded by alternating arpeggios provided by the left and the right hand, and again you won't be able to perceive the ascribed meter at all due to that consistent stream of the hemiolic melody that becomes the main audible guideline. Super twisted example, let's listen. This is such a weird passage. When you just look at the fingers playing, you wonder where the melody is actually coming from. It kinda looks like if I'm playing a different piece. Anyway, what I'm trying to show here is that Brahms' music is making a difference as he imposes abstract constructive concepts onto his textures. In other words, whilst most ordinary 19th century composers are striving for nice, enjoyable music, he's really going for some next level stuff.